Beets. One of the things that we sometimes associate beets with is sugar.
Yes.
There was maybe 100 years ago, maybe even more recently, quite a big sugar beet industry in Wisconsin.
Huge.
Can you say something about that?
Of course. Yeah, it's a great question. So just like we said that the table beet comes from Swiss chard, the sugar beet comes from that as well. The sugar beet is a modern relative of this. This thing produces sugar, which is sucrose. Humans selected initially for a big root that they could feed to livestock. And this goes back many, many centuries, and particularly in Europe. They selected for a large root that was not very attractive and not something you'd ever eat as a vegetable, but something you could let cattle graze, or animals would eat it. When Europe needed a domestic source of sugar, this was partly because during the Napoleonic Wars, they had their sugar produced in the slave colonies in the Caribbean, and they couldn't access their source of sugarcane sugar. Europe really wanted a domestic source of sugar, and so they started selecting that animal feed beet, that livestock feed beet, for high levels of sucrose, and they made sugar beet. And they made the modern sugar beet, which really is only a couple hundred years old, 250 years old, let's say. That sugar beet then became, in temperate parts of the world, a really valuable source of sugar. Instead of getting tropical sugar from sugarcane, you could then, in places like Germany or France or Northern Europe, you could grow sugar. And of course, we started growing it in the United States too. Temperate regions like Wisconsin were perfect for producing sugar. We had also the infrastructure to crystallize the sugar and make a factory to produce beet sugar. And we had one in Madison, and we had them around Wisconsin. The crop moved west. It moved into Minnesota, into the Dakotas, and even into places like Idaho and Montana. And that's really where a lot of sugar is still produced. Also California. And so I would say that this environment is still perfect for sugar production, but I think because the infrastructure moved west, perhaps because of pests and diseases and just better production conditions, we moved away from sugar beet. But nevertheless, it would be a perfect environment to do it today.
If you sat there with two sugar cubes, one from sugarcane and one from beets, could a discerning palate actually tell the difference?
You couldn't. The only way to tell the difference between those two would be isotopic analysis, because I think sugarcane is a C4 plant, and so I think you could probably, there may be a way to detect it that way, but not in any, it is exactly the same molecule. And so it is sucrose, yeah. And I would say today, about 50% of US sugar is sugar beet. So it's a pretty significant source of sugar.
Wonderful.
And another thing I would say about it, and this is more on the social justice side, and I know your class is going to be exploring this. I feel like sugarcane sugar relies so heavily on human labor, and also very, very difficult labor under difficult conditions. The sugar beet initially did, of course, but is a much more mechanized, and I'm not saying that there's no labor involved, I'm saying the labor conditions are just a little bit different, and it's much more of an industrial crop. And so I think around the world, there's a certain amount of social justice that can be attributed to the development of beet sugar.
And plus, you can produce it locally too,
yes.
which is another thing.
Exactly.
Appropriate to the conditions where it is. You're not bringing it in from,
Right. It doesn't have to be a tropical sugar that gets right. It could be grown right here.